The rain fell in sheets that October evening, as if the heavens themselves wept for the injustices of the world below. Marcus Ashford stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city lights blur and shimmer through the cascading water. He was a man of considerable fortune, though whether that fortune had brought him happiness was a question he had long ceased to ask himself. At 42, he had built an empire from nothing, transforming a modest inheritance into a technology conglomerate that touched nearly every aspect of modern life. Yet, as he stood there, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that others envied, he felt nothing but a profound emptiness that no acquisition could fill. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged well, perhaps too well for his own good. Dark hair threaded with distinguished silver, a face that bore the marks of determination rather than cruelty, and eyes that had once sparkled with ambition, but now held only a weary resignation. He loosened his tie, a gesture of defeat at the end of another meaningless day. The merger he had been negotiating for months had finally closed, adding another billion to his net worth. The champagne his colleagues had insisted on opening sat untouched on his desk, its bubbles long since gone flat, much like his capacity for celebration. It was then that his phone buzzed with a notification from an application he had nearly forgotten he had installed. Some months ago, his sister had pestered him endlessly about his solitary existence, insisting that he needed companionship, or at the very least, some form of human connection beyond board meetings and shareholder calls. In a moment of weakness, or perhaps merely to silence her concerns, he had agreed to install a tracking application on his household staff's devices. Not for surveillance, he had told himself, but for security purposes. His staff had consented, of course, for what choice did they have when their livelihoods depended upon his goodwill? Yet he had never once looked at the application until this moment, when an alert appeared indicating unusual activity on one of the devices. The name attached to the alert was Elena Vasquez, his housemaid of 3 years. She was a quiet woman, perhaps 30 years of age, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience far beyond her years. He knew little of her personal life, as he knew little of any of his staff's lives. They existed in his world as shadows, performing their duties with efficiency and discretion, then vanishing into their own existences which he had never once thought to inquire about. Elena was different from the others, only in that she had a peculiar habit of leaving small touches of beauty in his otherwise sterile environment. Fresh flowers appeared in vases he had not known he owned. Books he had mentioned in passing would materialize on his nightstand. His coffee was always prepared exactly as he preferred it, though he could not recall having ever specified his preferences to her. The alert showed her location at a restaurant downtown, an establishment he recognized as mediocre at best, the sort of place where one went when resources were limited, but one wished to maintain some semblance of dining out. Curiosity, that dangerous companion of the idle wealthy, prompted him to look more closely. The application, designed with privacy features he had never bothered to disable, showed not only her location but her activity on her device. She had been searching for encouraging messages, articles about first date etiquette, and affirmations for women with low self-esteem. The picture these searches painted was so heartbreakingly vulnerable that Marcus felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he had thought long dead. Without quite understanding why, he found himself leaving his office, taking the private elevator down to the garage, and instructing his driver to take him to the restaurant. It was an impulse unlike any he had experienced in years, this sudden need to see for himself what was transpiring in the life of a woman he had barely noticed, despite her presence in his home nearly every day. Perhaps it was the loneliness of his own existence reflected in her searches, or perhaps it was simply that he needed to bear witness to something real, something human, after years of existing in the artificial world of high finance and corporate maneuvering. The restaurant was as unremarkable as he had imagined, tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store on a street that had seen better days. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see Elena sitting at a corner table, her posture betraying a nervous anticipation. She had dressed carefully, he could see, in a simple dress that was clean and pressed, but clearly not new. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant bun, and she wore minimal makeup, which somehow made her natural beauty more apparent than any artifice could have achieved. She kept glancing at her phone, then at the door, her hands fidgeting with the napkin on her lap. Marcus instructed his driver to park across the street, where he could observe without being seen. He felt absurd, like some character in a novel, spying on his employee's private life. Yet he could not bring himself to leave. There was something about the scene that held him transfixed, as if he were watching a play whose outcome he desperately needed to know. A waiter approached Eleanor's table, and even from this distance, Marcus could see her embarrassment as she declined to order, gesturing toward the door, indicating she was waiting for someone. The waiter's expression was one of practiced patience mixed with pity, a look that suggested he had seen many such scenes before. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Elena's hopeful glances toward the door became less frequent, her shoulders beginning to slump in the universal posture of disappointment. She checked her phone repeatedly, perhaps hoping for a message explaining her date's tardiness, perhaps simply giving her hands something to do. Marcus felt an unexpected anger rising in him at this unknown person who could so casually disrespect someone who was so clearly earnest in her expectations. He had seen such casual cruelty before, of course, had perhaps even participated in it himself in his younger days, but witnessing it inflicted upon someone he knew, however distantly, stirred something protective within him. At last, a man arrived, rushing through the door with the air of one who has been significantly delayed, but believes a hasty apology will suffice. He was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps 25, dressed in clothing that attempted to project success, but succeeded only in appearing cheap and pretentious. Eleanor's face brightened immediately at his arrival, her disappointment dissolving into relief and pleasure. She stood to greet him, but the man merely waved her back into her seat with a gesture that was almost dismissive. He did not apologize for his lateness, did not remove his jacket, did not even properly look at her as he collapsed into the chair opposite hers and immediately began scrolling through his phone. Marcus watched as Eleanor attempted to initiate conversation, her lips moving in what he imagined were pleasantries and gentle questions. The man responded without looking up from his device, his body language broadcasting disinterest and contempt in equal measure. When the waiter returned, the man ordered for himself without consulting Elena, choosing an expensive entree and a drink. Elena, when asked for her order, hesitated in a way that Marcus recognized immediately. It was the hesitation of someone calculating the contents of their wallet, weighing hunger against financial prudence. She ordered only a side salad and water, her voice barely audible even in Marcus's imagination. The man finally looked up from his phone, and his expression upon seeing Elena's modest order was one of such naked derision that Marcus felt his hands clench into fists. The distance and the rain-obscured window prevented him from hearing the words, but he could see the man's lips moving, could see Eleanor's face redden with humiliation. The man gestured at her dress, at the restaurant, at her order, his body language making clear that he found everything about this evening beneath him. He reached into his pocket and threw something onto the table between them. Even from across the street, Marcus could see they were bills, small denominations, perhaps $8 or $10 total. Elena stared at the money as if it were a serpent that might strike her. The man stood, still talking, his expression a mixture of disgust and self-righteousness. Other diners were beginning to notice the scene, their conversations pausing as they turned to watch this public humiliation unfold. The man's voice must have risen because heads throughout the restaurant swiveled toward their table. Eleanor remained seated, her hands now clasped tightly in her lap, her head bowed as if she could make herself disappear through sheer force of will. The man said something final, something that made her flinch as if struck, then turned and walked out, leaving her sitting there with those crumpled bills on the table before her. Marcus was out of the car before he consciously decided to move. His driver calling after him in surprise, he crossed the street, heedless of the rain, his expensive suit soaking through immediately, water streaming down his face as he pushed through the restaurant door. The hostess moved to greet him, but something in his expression made her step aside. He walked directly to Elena's table, where she still sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the money that represented not generosity, but insult. Not assistance, but abandonment. She looked up at his approach, and the recognition in her eyes was followed immediately by horror. To be seen by one's employer in such a moment of degradation, to have one's private shame witnessed by the man who held one's livelihood in his hands, was perhaps worse than the humiliation itself. She moved to stand, to flee, but Marcus held up a hand, his voice gentle despite the rage that burned in his chest. He asked if he might sit, a question that surprised them both. For what need did Marcus Ashford have to ask permission for anything? She nodded mutely, her eyes now filling with tears she was clearly desperate not to shed. He sat across from her, in the seat so recently vacated by that contemptible young man, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant had grown quiet, the other diners pretending not to watch while watching intently. Marcus became aware of the water dripping from his clothing onto the cheap vinyl seat, of the absurdity of his presence in this place, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the woman before him, whose dignity had been assaulted, whose simple hope for connection had been met with cruelty. He reached across the table and pushed the crumpled bills toward her, then withdrew his wallet and placed several $100 bills on top of them. Elena's eyes widened in confusion and fresh shame. She began to protest, her voice breaking, saying she could not accept his charity, that she had not meant for him to see this, that she would understand if he wished to terminate her employment. Her words tumbled over each other in her distress, her accent becoming more pronounced as emotion overwhelmed her usual, careful English. Marcus waited until she fell silent, then spoke words he had not known he was going to say until they emerged from his lips. He told her that the money was not charity, but payment for services rendered, for 3 years of making his house a home, even when he had not had the grace to notice or appreciate it. He told her that he was not here to judge her or to pity her, but simply because no one should have to endure such treatment alone. The tears she had been holding back began to fall then, silent streams down her cheeks that she made no move to wipe away. She whispered that she was sorry, though for what she was apologizing, Marcus could not fathom. Sorry for crying, sorry for existing, sorry for daring to hope that someone might value her company. He found himself reaching across the table to take her hand, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both with its intimacy. Her hand was small and calloused in his, the hand of someone who worked with her hands, who earned her living through physical labor rather than the manipulation of numbers and contracts that constituted his own work. He told her that she had nothing to apologize for, that the fault lay entirely with the worthless creature who had just left, who clearly lacked the basic decency and intelligence to recognize quality when it sat before him. He heard his own voice, usually so measured and controlled in business dealings, becoming passionate, almost angry on her behalf. She looked at him with wonder, as if she could not quite believe that Marcus Ashford, the man who barely acknowledged her presence in his home, was sitting in a mediocre restaurant defending her honor to an audience of curious strangers. Perhaps she could not believe it because he could barely believe it himself. The waiter approached hesitantly, unsure whether to intrude on this unexpected scene. Marcus ordered without consulting a menu, asking for the restaurant's finest dishes, wine, dessert, everything they had that might constitute a proper meal. He told the waiter to bring it all, and to do so with the respect that every patron deserved, regardless of their apparent means. The waiter nodded vigorously, perhaps recognizing in Marcus's bearing and clothing the presence of someone who could make or break his evening's tips, perhaps simply responding to the authority in his voice. He scurried away, leaving Marcus and Elena alone once more in their bubble of unexpected intimacy. Elena finally spoke, her voice steadier now, asking why he was doing this, why he had come, how he had even known where she was. Marcus hesitated, unwilling to reveal the tracking application, the invasion of privacy that had brought him here. He settled for a half-truth, saying that he had been passing by, had seen her through the window, had witnessed enough to understand that intervention was necessary. It was a flimsy explanation, and they both knew it, but she accepted it with a small nod, perhaps too overwhelmed to press for details, perhaps simply grateful not to examine too closely this unexpected kindness from an unexpected source. As they waited for the food, Marcus found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask before. Where was she from? How long had she been in this country? What had brought her here, to this city, to his employment? Elena answered haltingly at first, then with increasing openness, as she realized his interest was genuine. She spoke of a small village in Ecuador, of parents who had sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they had never had, of dreams of education and advancement that had foundered on the harsh realities of immigration status and economic necessity. She had been studying nursing when her visa situation had become complicated, forcing her to take whatever work she could find that would allow her to remain in the country legally. She spoke of loneliness, of being far from family, of the particular isolation that comes from serving in the homes of the wealthy while barely scraping by oneself. Marcus listened with an attention he had not given to anyone in years, and as he listened, he began to see his own life reflected back at him in stark relief. Here was someone who had so little but gave so much, who faced each day with a hope and determination he had lost somewhere along his climb to success. Her struggles made his own concerns seem petty and self-indulgent. What right had he to feel empty when he had everything? Yet her presence, her dignity in the face of humiliation, her continued kindness despite the world's hardness, made him realize that perhaps what he lacked was not something money could buy, but something he had simply forgotten how to feel. The food arrived, plates of it, far more than two people could reasonably consume. Elena protested the excess, but Marcus insisted, and gradually she began to eat, her earlier appetite apparently returning now that she was no longer facing the prospect of stretching $8 into a meal. They ate and talked, and the conversation flowed more easily than any Marcus had experienced in years. She asked him questions too, about his business, his family, his life, questions he found himself answering with unusual honesty. He spoke of his late wife, gone 5 years now to cancer, of how he had buried himself in work to avoid the grief, of how that work had consumed him until there was nothing left but the work itself. Elena listened with the same attention he had given her, and when he finished speaking, she said something that struck him with the force of revelation. She said that perhaps what he needed was not less work, but more life, that perhaps the problem was not that he worked too hard, but that he had forgotten why he worked at all. She said it gently, without judgment, but the words cut through his defenses like nothing had in years. He realized that this woman, whom he had barely noticed, whom society deemed far beneath his station, possessed a wisdom and insight that all his education and success had failed to provide him. The evening stretched on in a manner that defied Marcus's expectations, transforming from a rescue mission into something far more profound and unsettling. They talked until the restaurant staff began making pointed gestures of closing, stacking chairs on distant tables and dimming lights in a universal signal that their presence, however lucrative it might have been, was no longer desired. Marcus left a tip that would likely constitute the waiter's best evening in months, perhaps years, and offered to drive Elena home. She hesitated, and he could see the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of propriety against practicality, the awareness that accepting such an offer from one's employer carried implications she might not wish to entertain. Yet the rain had intensified to a degree that made the thought of public transportation seem almost punitive, and so she accepted with visible reluctance. His driver, who had been waiting with admirable patience, betrayed no surprise at Eleanor's presence as they settled into the car's leather interior. The vehicle itself seemed almost obscene in its luxury compared to the restaurant they had just left, and Marcus became acutely aware of the disparity it represented. Elena sat rigidly in her seat, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the window as they glided through the rain-slicked streets. The address she provided led them to a neighborhood Marcus recognized vaguely as one of the city's less prosperous areas, though not its most dangerous. The buildings were old, but maintained with a certain desperate pride, their facades bearing the marks of both decay and determined upkeep. The apartment building before which they stopped was a narrow structure squeezed between similar edifices, its entrance illuminated by a single flickering bulb that cast uncertain shadows. Elena moved to exit quickly, murmuring her thanks with downcast eyes, clearly eager to escape the awkwardness of the situation. But Marcus found himself speaking before she could flee, asking if he might see her again, not as employer and employee, but as what they had become this evening, two solitary souls who had found unexpected understanding in each other's company. The words sounded absurd, even to his own ears, like dialogue from a romance novel, yet he meant them with a sincerity that surprised him. Elena turned back to face him, and in the dim light he could see confusion warring with something else in her expression. Perhaps hope, perhaps fear, perhaps both intermingled. She reminded him, her voice careful and measured, that such an arrangement would be inappropriate, that he was her employer, that she depended upon his goodwill for her livelihood, that any relationship beyond the professional would be fraught with complications neither of them should willingly embrace. Her words were sensible, prudent, the very objections he himself would have raised in any other circumstance. Yet sensibility and prudence seemed suddenly like poor companions compared to the connection he had felt this evening, the first genuine human connection he had experienced since his wife's death. He assured her that her employment was secure regardless of her answer, that he would never use his position to pressure her into anything she did not freely choose. He acknowledged the complications she raised, admitted that what he was suggesting defied conventional wisdom and proper boundaries. Yet he also said, with a vulnerability he had not displayed in years, that he had felt more alive in these few hours with her than he had in the 5 years since his wife's passing, and that if she felt even a fraction of the same, perhaps they owed it to themselves to explore what this unexpected encounter might mean. He spoke with an eloquence born of desperation, aware that he was likely making a fool of himself, yet unable to stop the words that poured forth. Elena stood in the rain, heedless of the water that plastered her hair to her face and soaked through her dress. She studied him with those dark eyes that seemed to see far more than they should, and he wondered what she found in his own gaze. At last she spoke, saying that she would think upon his words, that such a decision could not be made in the heat of emotion following an evening as strange and unexpected as this had been. She asked for time to consider, and he granted it readily, though the disappointment must have shown in his face. She touched his hand briefly through the open car door, a gesture of comfort or perhaps farewell, then turned and hurried into her building, leaving him sitting in his car, watching her disappear into the shadows. The drive back to his penthouse seemed interminable, though in reality it consumed perhaps 20 minutes. His driver maintained a discreet silence, for which Marcus was grateful, as he had no capacity for conversation. His mind churned with the events of the evening, replaying each moment, each word, each glance. He felt simultaneously exhilarated and foolish, like a young man experiencing his first infatuation rather than a mature businessman of considerable means and experience. What was he doing, pursuing his housemaid with all the ardor of a romantic hero? What could possibly come of such an ill-advised connection? Yet even as his rational mind catalogued the many reasons why he should abandon this course, his heart, that treacherous organ, insisted that he had finally found something worth pursuing beyond the sterile accumulation of wealth and power. Sleep eluded him that night, as he lay in his enormous bed staring at the ceiling, seeing not the expensive plasterwork, but Elena's face as she had looked in the restaurant, equal parts humiliated and dignified. He thought of the casual cruelty of the man who had thrown those few dollars at her, as if she were a beggar, rather than a human being deserving of respect. He thought of his own complicity in a system that valued people based on their financial worth, that treated those who served as invisible and interchangeable. How many Elenas had he encountered in his life without truly seeing them? How many people had he dismissed or ignored because they lacked the markers of success he had been conditioned to recognize? Morning arrived with the inevitability of all mornings, bringing with it the responsibilities and routines that governed his existence. He rose, showered, dressed in his uniform of expensive suit and silk tie, and prepared to face another day of meetings and decisions that would affect thousands of people he would never meet. Yet, as he moved through these familiar rituals, he found himself listening for sounds that would indicate Elena's presence. She typically arrived at 7 in the morning, letting herself in with the key he had provided, beginning her work in the kitchen, before moving through the rest of the penthouse with quiet efficiency. He had never before noticed her arrival, had usually been gone before she started her day, yet now he waited with an anxiety that was almost painful. When she did arrive, he was sitting at his kitchen counter with an untouched cup of coffee before him, ostensibly reviewing documents on his tablet, but in reality, simply waiting. She stopped upon seeing him, her expression carefully neutral, then proceeded to her work as if nothing had changed, as if they had not spent the previous evening sharing intimacies and awkward proposals. He watched her move about the kitchen, her movements practiced and efficient, and wondered if he had imagined the connection between them, if the entire evening had been merely a figment of his desperate loneliness given tangible form. She prepared his breakfast without being asked, eggs and toast arranged with a precision that suggested years of practice in meeting others' unstated needs. She placed the plate before him with a murmured greeting, her eyes not meeting his, then turned to begin cleaning. He found himself unable to eat, unable to focus on anything but her presence and her determined avoidance of meaningful interaction. At last, unable to bear the tension any longer, he spoke her name. She paused in her work, her back to him, her shoulders tensing in a way that suggested she had been expecting and dreading this moment. He asked, his voice careful and gentle, if she had considered what he had said the previous evening. She remained still for a long moment, then slowly turned to face him. Her expression was troubled, her hands clasped before her in a gesture that might have been supplication or self-protection. She said that she had thought of little else, that she had lain awake most of the night turning his words over in her mind, examining them from every angle, like a jeweler studying a stone for flaws. She admitted that she had felt the connection he described, that the evening had affected her, perhaps even more than it had affected him, for she had not expected kindness from him, had not imagined that he even knew her name beyond its appearance on her employment paperwork. Yet she also spoke of the profound inequality between them, not merely in terms of wealth, but in power and position. She reminded him that he held her continued employment, her ability to remain in this country, her very livelihood in his hands. Any relationship between them, however genuine it might feel in the moment, would always be shadowed by that imbalance. If she agreed to see him outside the boundaries of their professional relationship and then later wished to end whatever developed between them, could she do so without fear of retaliation? Could she speak her mind freely, disagree with him, challenge him, as an equal partner must be able to do? Or would she always be constrained by the awareness that her opinions and desires existed in the context of her dependence upon his continued favor? Marcus listened to her concerns with a growing respect for her intelligence and self-awareness. She was not being coy or playing games, as others in her position might have done, seeing an opportunity for advancement through his interest. Rather, she was articulating real and substantive problems that he, in his enthusiasm and emotional need, had failed to fully consider. He acknowledged the validity of everything she said, admitted that he had no easy answers to the questions she raised. Yet he also suggested that perhaps they were allowing fear of what might go wrong to prevent them from discovering what might go right. He proposed a solution, one that came to him even as he spoke. He would arrange for her employment to be transferred to an agency, one that would place her in other homes, while continuing to pay her the same wage she currently earned. He would provide her with a financial cushion, funds placed in an account in her name that would ensure her independence regardless of what transpired between them personally. She could then choose freely whether to see him, knowing that her security was not dependent upon his goodwill. If she decided against pursuing any relationship with him, she would still have the financial stability and employment security he had arranged. If she chose to explore what had begun between them, she would do so as his equal, at least in terms of her ability to walk away. Elena stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign tongue. The magnitude of what he was offering seemed to overwhelm her, and he could see her struggling to process the implications. It was an enormous gesture, one that put her in a position of power rather than subservience, and he could see both her desire to accept and her fear that acceptance would create obligations of its own. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, why he would do such a thing, what he hoped to gain that would justify such an expenditure and arrangement. Was this not simply another form of purchase, an attempt to buy her affection through generous provision? He considered her question carefully before responding, for it deserved more than a facile answer. He told her that he could not claim his motives were entirely selfless, that he did hope she would choose to see him, to give them both the opportunity to discover if what they had felt the previous evening could develop into something more substantial and lasting. Yet he also said that regardless of her choice, he had been awakened by their encounter to the realization of how many people like her existed in the shadows of his life, working to maintain his comfort while struggling to maintain their own survival. If he could improve even one person's circumstances, if he could offer security and dignity to someone who deserved both, then that was worth doing regardless of any personal benefit he might derive. She was crying then, silently, tears streaming down her face as she listened to him speak. She made no move to wipe them away, simply let them fall as she stood before him in her simple work clothes, a woman confronting an offer that seemed too generous to be real and too real to be dismissed as fantasy. She asked him for time, not to reconsider whether she wished to see him, for she admitted with startling honesty that she did, but to adjust to the radical change in circumstances he was proposing. To go from precarious employment and constant financial anxiety to security and independence was not a transition that could be made overnight, even with the best of intentions and the most generous of patrons. Marcus agreed readily to give her whatever time she needed, relief flooding through him at her admission that she did wish to see him, that he had not misread or imagined the connection between them. He told her that he would begin arrangements immediately for the transfer of her employment and the establishment of her financial security, that these things would proceed regardless of how long she needed to adjust or what she ultimately decided about a personal relationship with him. He wanted her to have no doubt that his offer was genuine and unconditional, that he was not holding her future hostage to her romantic interest in him. They stood looking at each other across the kitchen counter, the employer and the employee whose roles were even now shifting into something neither could quite define. The moment held a peculiar intimacy, freighted with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Elena finally spoke, saying that she needed to continue her work, that she could not simply stand there all day, contemplating the strangeness of what was happening to her life. Marcus laughed, a sound that surprised them both with its genuine warmth, and agreed that he too needed to attend to his responsibilities, though he suspected neither of them would be particularly effective in their respective tasks that day. As he left for his office, Marcus found his thoughts entirely consumed, not with mergers or markets, but with the woman he had left behind in his penthouse, scrubbing floors and polishing surfaces, while contemplating a future radically different from what she had imagined when she woke that morning. He wondered what she was thinking, what fears and hopes were coursing through her mind. He wondered if he was being foolish, if he was simply trying to fill the void left by his wife's death with the first woman who had sparked any interest in him. Yet he suspected it was more than that Eleanor had awakened something in him that had nothing to do with replacement and everything to do with recognition, with seeing and being seen in a way that transcended the superficial categories by which people usually sorted each other. His assistant, a woman of formidable efficiency named Margaret, who had been with him for over a decade, noticed immediately that something was different. She commented, with the frankness that came from long service, that he seemed distracted, almost happy, an adjective she admitted she had not applied to him in years. He confided in her, surprising himself with the confession, telling her in broad strokes what had transpired and what he was planning. Margaret listened with her characteristic attention, her expression betraying no judgment, though he suspected she harbored considerable concern about his plan. When he finished, she asked simply if he was certain he knew what he was doing, if he had considered all the ways this could complicate his life and potentially damage both his reputation and Elena's. He admitted that he had not considered all the implications, that he was acting more on instinct and emotion than on the careful analysis he typically brought to major decisions. Yet he also said that perhaps this was precisely what he needed, to act without endless calculation, to allow himself to be vulnerable and uncertain and hopeful. Margaret regarded him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, saying that if this was what he needed, she would support him in it, but that she hoped he would protect Elena from any potential consequences of his interest in her. He assured her that this was precisely his intention, that Elena's welfare and security were paramount in his planning. The next several days passed in a blur of unusual activity as Marcus set about arranging the transfer of Elena's employment and the establishment of her financial security. He worked with an employment agency that specialized in placing domestic workers, ensuring that they understood Elena was to be treated with the utmost respect and consideration, that her schedule was to be flexible, and her assignments limited to positions that met strict criteria for safety and appropriate treatment. He established an account in her name with sufficient funds to provide her with several years of financial security, even if she never worked another day. He consulted with an immigration attorney to ensure that her visa status would not be jeopardized by the change in employment circumstances. All of this he did quietly, without fanfare, instructing those involved to maintain discretion about his involvement. He did not want Elena to feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the changes being wrought on her behalf, nor did he want her to feel obligated by the scale of his intervention in her life. Yet he also could not help but feel a sense of satisfaction in using his wealth and influence for something more meaningful than the accumulation of additional wealth and influence. He was solving a problem, yes, but more than that, he was affirming the worth and dignity of another human being in a way that his business dealings rarely allowed. Elena continued to work in his penthouse during this period, and their interactions maintained a careful professionalism that was belied by the intensity of what remained unspoken between them. Yet there were moments when their eyes would meet and hold, when a hand would brush against another in passing, when the air between them seemed to crackle with possibility and restraint. Marcus found himself looking forward to these encounters with an anticipation that made him feel young again, alive to the potential of each moment, rather than simply enduring the passage of time. The transformation of Elena's circumstances was completed within a fortnight, a speed that reflected both Marcus's determination and the power that came with significant wealth. He presented her with the documentation on a Thursday evening, After she had finished her work for the day, she stood in his living room, still wearing the simple uniform of her profession, and read through the papers with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching awe. The account statements showed a sum that represented more money than she could have earned in years of the work she had been doing. The employment contract with the agency guaranteed her hours, fair treatment, and wages that exceeded what most domestic workers could hope for. The letter from the immigration attorney outlined steps that could potentially lead to permanent residency, removing the constant anxiety that had shadowed her existence since arriving in this country. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and for a moment Marcus feared he had miscalculated, that the magnitude of what he had done had frightened rather than freed her. But when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion that was unmistakably joy, mixed with gratitude and perhaps something deeper. She said that no one had ever done anything like this for her, that she had not known such generosity was possible from someone who owed her nothing, who had no obligation to care about her struggles or her future. She asked what she could possibly do to repay him, how she could ever express adequate thanks for a gift so profound it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. Marcus moved closer to her, close enough that he could have touched her, but restraining himself from doing so, aware that this moment was too significant to be complicated by physical intimacy. He told her that she owed him nothing, that repayment was neither expected nor desired. He said that if she wished to thank him, she could do so by accepting that she deserved security and dignity, by believing that her worth as a human being was not determined by her financial circumstances or her employment status. He also said, his voice dropping to something almost vulnerable, that if she truly wished to give him something, she could give him the chance to know her better, to spend time with her not as employer and employee, but as two people discovering whether what they felt might grow into something lasting. She reached out then and took his hand, a gesture simple yet laden with significance. Her hand was warm in his, and he could feel the calluses that spoke of hard work, could feel the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness despite her apparent resolve. She told him that she had made her decision, that she had perhaps made it that first night in the restaurant when he had chosen to sit with her rather than let her suffer her humiliation alone. She said that she was frightened by the intensity of her feelings, by how quickly everything was moving, by the gap between their worlds that still existed regardless of his generous provisions. Yet she also said that she had learned long ago that safety and certainty were illusions, that the only real choice was whether to embrace life's possibilities or to hide from them in fear. They agreed to begin slowly, to take time to know each other properly before making any commitments or declarations that might be premature. Marcus suggested dinner the following evening, at a restaurant far superior to the one where they had first truly seen each other, though he noted with some irony that the quality of the establishment had nothing to do with the quality of the connection they had formed. Elena accepted with a smile that transformed her face, making her appear younger and lighter than he had ever seen her. As she prepared to leave his penthouse for what would be the last time as his employee, she paused at the door and looked back at him with an expression he could not quite read, but felt in his chest like a physical sensation. The following evening found Marcus in a state of nervous anticipation he had not experienced since his youth. He changed his clothes 3 times, unable to decide what struck the appropriate balance between showing respect for the occasion and not appearing to be trying too hard. He arrived at the restaurant early, a violation of every social convention he had been taught, but he could not bear the thought of Elena arriving first and waiting for him, a repetition of that terrible night that had brought them together. When she appeared in the doorway, he felt his breath catch in a manner that would have embarrassed him if he had been capable of caring about such things in that moment. She wore a dress he had never seen before, something simple yet elegant that suggested she had purchased it specifically for this evening. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders rather than being pulled back in the practical style she wore for work. She had applied makeup with a delicate hand that enhanced rather than concealed her natural features. But what struck him most was her bearing, the way she carried herself with a confidence he had not seen in her before. The crushing anxiety of her financial circumstances had been lifted, and in its absence, he could see the woman she truly was, undiminished by the constant stress of survival. They were seated at a table that offered both privacy and a view of the city lights spread below them like a carpet of stars. The conversation flowed easily, perhaps more easily than on their first evening together, for they had already breached the initial barriers of polite distance. Elena spoke of her childhood in Ecuador, of a mother who had been a teacher and a father who had worked in construction, of siblings scattered across 2 continents pursuing their own versions of the American dream. She spoke of her journey north, a story that was harrowing in its details, yet told without self-pity or drama, as if the hardships she had endured were simply facts to be acknowledged rather than tragedies to be mourned. Marcus found himself sharing stories from his own past, aspects of his life he rarely discussed with anyone. He spoke of his humble origins, of parents who had worked multiple jobs to provide him with educational opportunities they had never enjoyed themselves. He spoke of his first wife, a college sweetheart, who had believed in him when he had nothing but ambition and determination. He spoke of her illness, of watching her waste away despite the best medical care his growing fortune could provide, of the helplessness and rage he had felt at being unable to save the one person who truly mattered to him. Elena listened with a compassion that was neither pitying nor patronizing, and he realized that she understood loss in ways that many of his wealthy acquaintances never would. As the evening progressed, Marcus became aware of a shift occurring within himself, a fundamental reordering of priorities and perspectives. The world he had inhabited for so long, the world of board meetings and market analyses and strategic acquisitions, seemed suddenly remote and unimportant. What mattered was this moment, this conversation, this connection with another human being who saw him not as Marcus Ashford the billionaire, but as Marcus the man, with all his flaws and fears and hopes. Elena had a way of asking questions that cut through his usual defenses, that required honest answers rather than the polished responses he had perfected for interviews and presentations. She asked him what he wanted from life, not in the abstract sense of goals and achievements, but in the concrete sense of daily existence. What brought him joy? What made him feel truly alive? What did he do when he was alone and accountable to no one but himself? He found himself admitting that he did not know, that he had been running for so long from grief and emptiness that he had forgotten to consider where he was running to. She suggested with a gentleness that took the sting from the observation that perhaps what he needed was not to achieve more, but to be more, to inhabit his own life fully, rather than treating it as another project to be managed and optimized. They talked until the restaurant staff began their closing rituals, and even then, Marcus found himself reluctant to let the evening end. He suggested a walk, though the hour was late and the streets largely empty. Elena agreed, and they left the restaurant to wander through the city like characters in a film, finding beauty in the urban landscape that most of his associates would have considered merely functional. They walked past closed shops and shuttered businesses, past the occasional late-night wanderer, speaking sometimes and sometimes simply enjoying the companionable silence that had developed between them. It was Elena who finally broke the silence to observe that this, what they were doing now, was perhaps what had been missing from both their lives. Not grand gestures or expensive meals, though those had their place, but simply the presence of another person who made the world seem less lonely and more full of possibility. Marcus agreed, though he struggled to articulate the complexity of what he was feeling. He was a man accustomed to analyzing and explaining, to reducing emotions to their component parts and examining them clinically. Yet what he felt in Elena's presence resisted such reduction, existing instead as a totality that defied categorization. They reached Elena's apartment building far sooner than Marcus would have liked, though they had walked for over an hour through the quiet streets. She invited him up, a gesture that surprised them both, though she quickly clarified that she was not suggesting anything improper, simply that she would like to show him where she lived, to let him see this aspect of her life that he had only glimpsed from the outside. He accepted, curious despite himself to see the space she inhabited, to understand more fully the circumstances from which his intervention had rescued her. The apartment was small, consisting of a single room that served as bedroom, living area and kitchen combined, with a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. Yet Elena had made it a home through careful attention and personal touches. Books lined a makeshift shelf constructed from planks and bricks. Plants crowded the windowsill, reaching toward whatever light penetrated the narrow space between buildings. Photographs of family members smiled from frames arranged on every available surface. The space was scrupulously clean and organized, everything in its place, creating an impression of order and dignity despite the obvious limitations. Marcus felt something clench in his chest as he looked around this tiny domain, imagining Elena returning here each evening after working in his expansive penthouse. The contrast between their living situations, a stark illustration of the inequalities he had always known existed but had never fully confronted. She watched him taking in her circumstances, and he could see a flash of defensiveness in her expression, as if she expected judgment or pity. He assured her quickly that he was not judging, that in fact he found her apartment more a home than his penthouse had ever been, for it contained something his space lacked, evidence of a life actually lived rather than merely maintained. She relaxed at his words and offered him tea, which he accepted, though he rarely drank tea and never this late in the evening. They sat on her small sofa, which clearly also served as her bed, sipping tea from mismatched mugs and talking in voices kept low so as not to disturb her neighbors in the adjacent apartments. The intimacy of the setting seemed to encourage confidences, and Elena began to speak of things she had not mentioned earlier, of the loneliness that had been her constant companion since leaving her home country, of the fear that she would never find someone who could accept and love her for who she was, rather than what she could provide or what she represented. Marcus found himself making a confession of his own, admitting that he had been lonely too, profoundly so, though surrounded by people at all times. He spoke of the isolation that came with wealth and power, of how difficult it was to trust anyone's motives when one possessed things that others wanted. He told her that after his wife's death, he had convinced himself that he was better off alone, that opening himself to love again would only invite fresh pain and loss. Yet meeting Elena had awakened him to the realization that a life lived in defensive isolation was not really living at all, but merely existing, marking time until death claimed him. Elena reached over and took his hand, and in that small gesture, Marcus felt something shift irrevocably in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. He realized that this woman, who had so little by conventional measures, possessed something he had lost somewhere along his climb to success: the courage to be vulnerable, to risk rejection and pain for the possibility of connection and joy. He told her this, his voice rough with emotion, and she smiled at him with such warmth and understanding that he felt tears prick at his eyes for the first time in years. They sat together on that narrow sofa as the night deepened into early morning, neither quite willing to break the spell that had settled over them. Marcus knew he should leave, that the hour was unconscionably late, and propriety demanded he depart. Yet propriety seemed like a small consideration compared to the rightness he felt sitting beside Elena, their hands clasped together, their bodies close, but not touching beyond that single point of contact. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that moved him more than any grand declaration could have done. When he finally did leave, as dawn was beginning to lighten the sky beyond her window, Elena walked him to the door of her building. They stood facing each other in the shabby lobby, and Marcus found himself at a loss for words that could adequately express what the evening had meant to him. Elena seemed to understand his difficulty, and she reached up to touch his face gently, her palm warm against his cheek. She told him that she would see him again soon, that this was not an ending, but a beginning, that they had time to discover what they might become to each other. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt simultaneously chaste and deeply intimate, then forced himself to walk away before his resolve failed him entirely. The drive back to his penthouse passed in a blur of exhaustion and exhilaration. Marcus felt as though he had been awake for days rather than merely one night, yet he also felt more energized and alive than he could remember being in years. He knew that what was developing between himself and Elena was complicated, that there would be obstacles and challenges ahead, that not everyone would understand or approve of their connection. Yet he also knew, with absolute certainty, that he would navigate whatever difficulties arose, because the alternative, returning to the emptiness that had characterized his existence before that rainy evening in the mediocre restaurant, was unthinkable. His penthouse, when he entered it, seemed even more sterile and lifeless than usual. The expensive furnishings and artwork that had once given him satisfaction now appeared merely decorative, evidence of wealth, but not of life. He found himself wondering what Elena would think if she saw it through fresh eyes, whether she would find it impressive or simply cold. He suspected the latter, and for the first time, he found himself wanting to change his environment, to make it reflect something beyond financial success and good taste. He wanted it to become a home, a place where life happened, rather than where life was merely maintained between more important engagements. The following days established a pattern that would govern their developing relationship. Marcus and Elena saw each other frequently, meeting for meals and walks and conversations that stretched late into the night. They spoke of everything and nothing, sharing their histories and their hopes with an openness that Marcus had not experienced since his youth. Elena introduced him to aspects of the city he had never noticed, despite having lived there for decades. The small ethnic restaurants and neighborhood parks and street markets where life pulsed with an energy absent from the polished venues he typically frequented. Through her eyes, Marcus began to see his city anew, not as a collection of business opportunities and real estate investments, but as a living organism composed of countless individual stories and struggles and triumphs. She took him to meet her friends, other immigrants working multiple jobs to build lives in this new land, and he was struck by their resilience and optimism despite circumstances that would have crushed many. They welcomed him into their gatherings without apparent regard for his wealth or status, judging him instead on his treatment of Elena and his willingness to see them as people rather than problems or statistics. Marcus found himself changing in response to these experiences, his perspectives shifting in ways both subtle and profound. He began to question aspects of his business practices that he had previously accepted as simply the way things were done. He wondered about the people affected by his decisions, the workers whose jobs were eliminated in the name of efficiency, the small businesses crushed by his company's expansion. He did not suddenly become naive about the realities of capitalism or the necessities of running a competitive enterprise, but he did begin to consider whether there might be ways to pursue success that did not require the sacrifice of so many others' well-being. Elena noticed these changes in him and encouraged them without pushing, understanding instinctively that transformation could not be forced, but must be allowed to unfold at its own pace. She challenged his assumptions gently, asking questions that made him reconsider positions he had held for years. Yet she also understood the constraints within which he operated, the board members and shareholders who would not look kindly on any moves that prioritized social responsibility over profit maximization. She did not ask him to become someone he was not, only to consider whether he might use his power and influence in ways that aligned more closely with his evolving values. 3 months passed in this manner, months during which Marcus felt himself becoming a different man, or perhaps returning to the man he had been before ambition and grief had hardened him into something cold and calculating. His colleagues at work noticed the change. Though they struggled to identify its source, he was more patient in meetings, more willing to consider perspectives that challenged his own, more interested in the human implications of business decisions. His assistant Margaret, who had observed him with concern for years, told him one afternoon that whatever was happening to him, she approved, that he seemed more like the man she had first met when she joined his company than the driven automaton he had become in recent years. Yet not all the responses to his transformation were positive. Rumors began to circulate about his relationship with Elena, whispers that grew louder as they were seen together with increasing frequency in public spaces. The gossip pages of business publications, usually focused on mergers and market movements, began to take an unwelcome interest in his personal life. Who was this woman who had captured the attention of one of the city's most eligible and wealthy bachelors? What was her background? What did she want from him? The speculation ranged from the merely curious to the actively malicious, with some suggesting she was an opportunist seeking to secure her future through attachment to a wealthy man. Marcus found himself enraged by these insinuations, not on his own behalf, but on Elena's. She had done nothing to court public attention, had in fact actively avoided it, preferring their relationship to develop away from scrutinizing eyes. Yet the mere fact of her existence in his life, combined with her humble origins and current circumstances, was apparently enough to make her a target for those who could not conceive of a relationship built on genuine affection rather than calculation. He wanted to issue statements, to defend her publicly, to make clear to anyone who would listen that Elena was worth a dozen of the society women he might have dated with no comment or criticism. Elena, however, counseled restraint. She told him that engaging with gossip would only feed it, that the best response was to continue living their lives with integrity and allowing their actions to speak for themselves. She reminded him that she had faced prejudice and dismissal before, that being underestimated was something she had learned to endure and even occasionally use to her advantage. She said that the opinions of people who knew nothing of their actual relationship mattered far less than what existed between them, and that she would not allow strangers' judgments to poison what they were building together. Her grace in the face of such scrutiny humbled Marcus and made him love her more deeply, though he had not yet spoken that word aloud, uncertain whether it was too soon or whether she would welcome such a declaration. He contented himself with showing his feelings through actions, supporting her as she began to pursue the nursing education she had been forced to abandon years before. He ensured she had access to the best programs, not through direct financial contribution, which she had proudly refused, but through connections that opened doors previously closed to her. He celebrated each small success in her studies, as if it were his own achievement, taking genuine joy in watching her reclaim dreams she had thought forever lost. It was during this period that Marcus made a decision that would fundamentally alter not only his relationship with Elena, but his entire approach to his business and his life. He announced to his board of directors that he was establishing a foundation, one that would focus on supporting workers in low-wage industries, providing education and training opportunities, advocating for fair labor practices, and generally addressing the systemic inequalities he had only recently allowed himself to fully acknowledge. The initial endowment would come from his personal fortune, a sum so substantial that even his board members, accustomed to dealing with large numbers, appeared startled. The announcement created precisely the firestorm he had anticipated. Shareholders questioned whether he was fit to continue leading a company dedicated to maximizing profit if he was going to divert resources to charitable endeavors. Business publications ran analyses wondering whether Marcus Ashford had experienced some sort of breakdown or early onset crisis of conscience. His more conservative associates suggested, in carefully worded conversations, that he was being manipulated by his new girlfriend, that Elena had somehow seduced him into abandoning the principles that had made him successful. Marcus weathered this storm with a calm he had not known he possessed, secure in the knowledge that his decisions were right, even if they were unpopular. He made clear to his board that the foundation would be entirely separate from his company, funded by his personal wealth rather than corporate resources. He also made clear that if they wished to replace him as CEO, he would accept their decision, though he suspected finding someone who could match his track record of success would prove challenging. The board, after much heated discussion and several emergency meetings, ultimately decided that Marcus's personal philanthropy, however ill-advised they might consider it, was not grounds for his removal so long as it did not interfere with his professional responsibilities. Elena was both moved and troubled by these developments. She had not asked him to make these changes, had in fact been unaware he was considering such dramatic action. She worried that he was transforming his life in ways he might later regret, that he was allowing his feelings for her to override his judgment and good sense. When she expressed these concerns, Marcus assured her that while she had certainly been the catalyst for his transformation, the changes themselves reflected values he had always held, but had buried beneath layers of pragmatism and self-protection. He told her that she had not changed who he was, but had reminded him of who he wanted to be, and for that he would be eternally grateful regardless of what ultimately transpired between them. As winter descended upon the city, Marcus and Eleanor's relationship deepened in ways both expected and surprising. They spent holidays together, creating new traditions that blended their different backgrounds and experiences. Eleanor taught him to cook dishes from her homeland, and he discovered a pleasure in the simple act of preparing food alongside her that he had never found in the expensive restaurants he had frequented for years. They attended cultural events from both their worlds, and Marcus found himself developing appreciation for music and art he had previously dismissed or ignored. Yet they also faced challenges that tested the foundation they were building. Elena's immigration status, despite the attorney's best efforts, remained complicated, with bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to frustrate rather than facilitate resolution. Marcus used his influence where he could, but he also learned the limits of wealth and power when confronting systems designed to be indifferent to both. The experience was humbling and infuriating, giving him insight into the daily struggles faced by millions who lacked his resources and connections. There were also tensions arising from the fundamental differences in their backgrounds and experiences. Elena sometimes struggled with the casual ease with which Marcus made decisions involving significant expenses, while he occasionally failed to understand the anxiety that years of financial precarity had embedded in her psyche. They had disagreements about how to navigate the social obligations that came with his position, with Elena uncomfortable in situations where she felt on display or judged, while Marcus sometimes failed to recognize the subtle slights and condescensions she experienced in settings he found merely tedious. Yet they worked through these challenges with a commitment and honesty that gave Marcus hope that what they were building could endure. They learned to communicate their needs and concerns, to acknowledge their mistakes, to forgive each other's shortcomings. Elena helped Marcus understand that true partnership required vulnerability and trust, while he helped her recognize that accepting help was not the same as surrendering independence. They were, in short, learning to build a relationship based not on romantic fantasy, but on mutual respect and genuine affection. It was on an evening in early spring, nearly 6 months after that fateful night in the mediocre restaurant, that Marcus finally spoke the words he had been holding back. They were sitting in his penthouse, which Eleanor had gradually transformed through small touches into something resembling an actual home. She had coaxed him into replacing the sterile modern furniture with pieces that had character and warmth. She had filled the space with plants and books and small objects that told stories, rather than merely demonstrating good taste. She had, in short, brought life to a space that had been merely a showpiece. They were discussing plans for the foundation, which would officially launch the following month, when Marcus found himself simply looking at her, marveling at the reality of her presence in his life. She noticed his attention and asked what he was thinking, and he found himself unable to continue hiding behind careful restraint and measured responses. He told her that he loved her, that he had perhaps loved her from that first evening when he had seen her dignity in the face of humiliation, that she had transformed his life in ways he was still discovering. Elena sat very still, her expression unreadable, and for a terrible moment Marcus feared he had miscalculated, had moved too quickly, or presumed too much. But then tears began to slip down her cheeks, and she told him that she loved him too, that she had been afraid to say it first, worried that the inequality between their circumstances would make her declaration seem calculated rather than sincere. She said that loving him terrified her, for she had learned through hard experience that attachment brought vulnerability, that caring deeply about someone gave them power to hurt you in ways strangers never could. Marcus moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his and telling her that he understood her fears, for he shared them. He had loved and lost before, had experienced the particular agony of watching someone he loved slip away despite everything he could do to prevent it. Yet he also knew that choosing safety over love was a kind of death in itself, a slow withering of the spirit that left one alive but not truly living. He said that he wanted to build a life with her, whatever form that life might take, and that he was willing to face whatever challenges came their way if she was willing to face them alongside him. She agreed, though she insisted they continue taking their time, building their foundation slowly and carefully rather than rushing into commitments that might crack under pressure. Marcus readily agreed, content to let their relationship develop at whatever pace felt right to both of them. He had learned patience in these months with Elena, had discovered that some things could not be hurried and that the journey was often more important than the destination. The Foundation's launch was a major event, covered extensively by media outlets that were fascinated by Marcus Ashford's apparent transformation from ruthless businessman to social reformer. Elena stood beside him at the announcement, and he made clear in his remarks that she had been instrumental in opening his eyes to inequalities he had previously accepted as inevitable. He spoke of her courage and resilience, of everything he had learned from knowing her, and he saw in the audience both understanding and skepticism, people willing to believe in his sincerity and people convinced this was merely a public relations exercise that would fade with time. The foundation began its work immediately, funding education programs, supporting workers' rights organizations, providing legal assistance to those fighting exploitation and abuse. Marcus threw himself into this new venture with the same intensity he had brought to building his business empire, but with a crucial difference. Where his business success had been measured in profits and market share, his foundation's success would be measured in lives changed and opportunities created. It was more challenging in many ways, for the problems they were addressing were systemic and deeply entrenched, but it was also more satisfying than anything he had done in years. Elena completed her nursing training and began working at a community clinic that served primarily low-income and immigrant populations. Marcus watched her flourish in this role, using not only her technical skills, but her natural compassion and her understanding, born of experience, of the challenges faced by her patients. She came home exhausted but fulfilled, sharing stories of small victories and frustrating setbacks, and Marcus found vicarious joy in her obvious passion for her work. A year after their first meeting, Marcus asked Elena to marry him. He did not make a grand gesture or plan an elaborate proposal, but rather asked her quietly one evening as they sat together watching the city lights from his penthouse windows. He told her that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, that he wanted the right to be by her side through whatever joys and sorrows the future held, that he could not imagine returning to the empty existence he had inhabited before she entered his life. Elena did not answer immediately, and Marcus felt his heart constrict with fear that she would refuse. But when she finally spoke, it was to say yes, though she wanted him to understand what he was choosing. She would never be the sort of society wife his position might typically require, would never be comfortable at charity galas and fundraising events, would likely always feel more at home with her clinic patients than with his business associates. She would continue working, would maintain her own identity and pursuits, would expect him to be a true partner rather than a benefactor or protector. If he could accept all of that, could embrace a marriage of equals, rather than one based on traditional roles and expectations, then yes, she would marry him. Marcus assured her that this was precisely what he wanted, that her independence and strength were among the qualities he loved most about her. They married quietly 3 months later, in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family, eschewing the sort of elaborate society wedding that might have been expected. Elena wore a simple dress she had chosen herself, and Marcus thought she had never looked more beautiful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to support and challenge each other, to remain curious about each other even after years of familiarity, to build a life that reflected their shared values rather than society's expectations. The years that followed were not without challenges. Marcus faced continued criticism from some quarters for his philanthropic focus, with suggestions that he had grown soft or lost his edge. The foundation encountered obstacles and setbacks, discovering that changing systemic inequalities required more than money and good intentions. Elena struggled with the public scrutiny that came with being married to a prominent figure, occasionally longing for the anonymity she had enjoyed before. They had disagreements and disappointments, moments when their different backgrounds created friction or misunderstanding. Yet they also had triumphs and joys that more than compensated for the difficulties. The foundation began to show measurable impact, with workers gaining better conditions and opportunities they would not have had otherwise. Elena's clinic expanded its services, providing care to thousands who might otherwise have gone without. Marcus found satisfaction in his work that had eluded him for years, no longer measuring his success solely in financial terms, but in contribution to the broader good. They traveled together, experiencing the world not as wealthy tourists, but as curious learners eager to understand different cultures and perspectives. Most importantly, they built a relationship that sustained them both, a partnership that honored both their differences and their commonalities. Marcus learned to see the world through Elena's eyes, understanding inequalities and injustices he had previously been blind to or dismissed. Elena learned to accept that wealth and privilege, while creating barriers and obligations, could also be tools for positive change when wielded with conscience and care. They pushed each other to grow, to question their assumptions, to remain open to new understanding even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. 5 years after that rainy evening in the mediocre restaurant, Marcus found himself once again standing at his penthouse windows, watching the city lights shimmer through falling rain. But now, Elena stood beside him, her hand in his, and the view seemed entirely different than it had that night when he had been alone with his emptiness and his fortune. He reflected on how a single impulsive decision, the choice to follow a tracking alert and witness a stranger's humiliation, had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others touched by the foundation and by Elena's work. He thought about the man who had thrown those $8 at Elena, the casual cruelty that had seemed so devastating in the moment, but had ultimately been the catalyst for everything that followed. He wondered where that man was now, whether he had any idea of the chain of events his contempt had set in motion, whether he would care if he knew. He suspected not, for people like that rarely considered the consequences of their actions beyond their immediate gratification. Elena seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts. and she reminded him that while that evening had been painful, it had also been necessary. She said that sometimes the universe arranges circumstances in ways that seem cruel but turn out to be gifts, that what appears to be an ending is actually a beginning. She said that she was grateful in a strange way for that terrible night, because it had brought them together and set them both on paths they might never have found otherwise. Marcus pulled her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his, the steady beat of her heart, the reality of her presence that still sometimes seemed too good to be true. He told her that he was grateful too, for everything, even the pain and difficulty, because it had all led to this moment, to this life they had built together. He said that watching her being mocked with just $8 had indeed changed his life forever, but not in ways he could have predicted or imagined, and that every day with her was a reminder that the most important things in life could not be purchased or planned, but only recognized and cherished when they appeared. They stood together in silence, watching the rain fall on the city below, two people who had found each other across the barriers of class and circumstance, who had chosen to build a life based on love and mutual respect rather than convention and expectation. They had not solved all the world's problems, had not eliminated inequality or injustice, had not even fully reconciled all the tensions in their own relationship. But they had proved, at least to themselves, that connection across difference was possible, that wealth did not have to corrupt, that poverty did not have to diminish, that two people willing to truly see each other could build something lasting and real. The foundation continued its work, expanding its reach and impact year after year. Elena's clinic grew into a network of facilities, serving communities across the city. Marcus gradually shifted more of his business responsibilities to others, focusing his energy on the philanthropic work that had become his true passion. They remained together through the years that followed, supporting each other through triumphs and setbacks, aging together with grace and continued affection. And sometimes, when asked about the secret to their success, both personal and professional, Marcus would tell the story of that rainy evening in the mediocre restaurant, of $8 thrown in contempt that had purchased something beyond price. He would speak of Elena's dignity in humiliation, of his own unexpected response to witnessing injustice, of the chain of choices and chances that had brought them together. He would say that the greatest privilege of wealth was not what it could buy, but what it could enable you to see if you were willing to look, and that the greatest poverty was not material lack, but blindness to the humanity of those around you. Elena would add that transformation was always possible, that people were capable of change at any age or stage of life, that it was never too late to recognize what truly mattered and to orient one's life accordingly. She would say that love in its truest form was not about grand gestures or expensive gifts, but about daily choices to see and value another person, to support their growth, to build together something neither could have achieved alone. Their story became, in its own small way, part of the city's mythology, a reminder that connection could happen in unexpected ways, that barriers of class and circumstance were not as insurmountable as they might appear, that a single evening could indeed change everything. Not everyone believed the story or accepted its implications, for it challenged comfortable assumptions about how the world worked and who belonged with whom. But for those willing to listen, it offered hope that life could surprise us, that we could surprise ourselves, that it was possible to build something real and lasting even from the most unpromising beginnings. And so Marcus and Elena continued their life together, two people who had found each other across a great divide, who had chosen each other despite every reason they should not have, who had proved through their years together that love, real love, recognized no barriers save those we ourselves erected. They had their share of sorrow and struggle, as all lives must, but they also had the deep satisfaction of knowing they had built something true, had made choices that aligned their actions with their values, had used their combined strengths to make some small corner of the world better than they had found it. The $8 that had sparked it all remained framed and mounted in their home, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. Visitors sometimes asked about it, puzzled by why such a small and seemingly insignificant sum would be preserved and displayed. Marcus and Elena would exchange glances, their eyes holding the memory of that evening and everything that had followed, and they would simply say that it represented the beginning of their story, the moment when everything changed, the price of discovering what truly mattered. And in the quiet moments, when it was just the two of them, they would remember that rainy evening and marvel at the mystery of it all, at how the worst moment of one life could become the best moment of two lives intertwined, at how $8 could purchase not just a meal or an insult, but a future neither had imagined possible. A love that had transformed them both into better versions of themselves, a partnership that had shown them both what it meant to truly live rather than merely exist. They had found, against all odds and expectations, exactly what they had been searching for without knowing they were searching, and they held onto it with gratitude and wonder, knowing how rare and precious it was, how easily it might have never been at all.